Chapter 23. "How far do you think it is, Lucas?" asked Sig with a wide smile. It was obvious he was excited to reach their destination by the frequency he repeated that question. Lucas might have been annoyed if it had been Jennifer asking the question, since he knew she would have been asking out of laziness, but he did not mind answering Sig. "I think we'll be there in 2.5 days, replied Lucas. Sig laughed energetically. His attitude was contagious, and even with the doom and gloom that Stephanie had felt, she smiled at the news that they had cut the distance to their destination in half since they had started. "Fantastic," said Sig with a grin as he turned to Daniel. "How are you holding up, Doctor?" "I'm all right," said Daniel as he wiped sweat off of his face. "Lizard?" asked Sig. "I'd be much better if I thought that Felix Light wasn't chasing us," said Lizard with air quotes. Jennifer nodded in silent agreement with Lizard. His presence meant that pressure would be on her to help defend against whatever offense the demon worshipper was planning on bringing against them. Of course, Lucas had everyone prepared with wired grenades, just in case. She looked at Victor. He was smiling, probably because he appreciated Lizard's candid observation. Whatever his reason, she found his smile relaxing, and she could not help as the corners of her lips turned up. "Jonathan, Kirana?" asked Sig, who had clearly decided to check on everyone. "I'm fine," said Jonathan enthusiastically as he smiled and looked at Kirana. "Whatever," said Kirana unenthusiastically. Stephanie glared at Kirana. She longed to trade positions with her, so that Jonathan's smile would not be wasted on someone who did not seem to appreciate it. "Jennifer? Victor?" asked Sig, who had anticipated the response. They smiled in acknowledgement. "Never better," said Victor. "Ditto," said Jennifer. Sig gave a look of confusion. "Ditto?" asked Sig. "What is that?" Jennifer turned and realized that Victor was also confused. "You know," explained Jennifer. "It means the same. Victor said never better. I am the same." Victor nodded, accepting the explanation. Sig shook his head in confusion. "Stephanie?" asked Sig. She typed into her tablet. "I am fine," she said. "Fantastic," exclaimed Sig. "I think things are looking up for us." The words had scarcely left Sig's lips when a loud shriek echoed through the foothills. They spun around to confirm their suspicions. They recognized Row 82's vehicle moving up a hill in the distance. Stephanie furrowed her brow in anger and rushed toward the vehicle. "Wait!" shouted Lucas. He rushed after her. Sig started to follow, but Daniel grabbed his arm. "We are not on a quest for vengeance," hissed the doctor. "You don't have to convince me," said Sig with a smile. Daniel released Sig's arm and lowered his head. "Sorry, I know you've got your priorities correct. I just," said Daniel. Sig laughed. "Well, come on," said Sig. "Grab Stephanie's arm and give her the lecture." Daniel smiled and nodded. They began moving towards Stephanie. "Kirana," said Sig, "get out your rifle. We do want to keep an eye on the augment." Kirana nodded and pulled out her sniper rifle. She paused and located Row 82's truck in her scope. He looked directly at her, as if he knew exactly where she was and what she was doing. It made Kirana uncomfortable, and she stopped looking to catch up to the others. "Lizard," said Sig, "can you scout the area in the direction he's heading?" "Consider it done," said Lizard, and he scurried off quickly. Stephanie rushed ahead toward the truck. She clenched her fists as she sprinted ahead. She pulled out the pistol she had acquired from the plantation and pointed it towards the truck. She squeezed the trigger and the gun went off. The kick of the pistol caused her hand to fly back, and the next shot she fired went into the air. "Stephanie, stop!" screamed Lucas as he dove down behind a rock. 2 more rounds went off into the air before she stopped firing. She pulled the pistol down and gripped it with both hands, then pointed at the truck and fired again. This time the force of the kick threw her back, and she stumbled as she tried to keep her balance. "Stephanie!" shouted Sig with laughter. Stephanie was determined to try to do something to attack the truck that was driving up the hills, and fired one more round. Lucas rushed out and grabbed Stephanie's arm. "You've got to stabilize yourself before you fire," said Lucas. His eyes were still filled with fear. "And try only to use bullets when you've got a better chance of hitting him." Stephanie lowered her firearm and clenched her teeth. Firing the gun had been exhilarating, but she knew that Lucas was right, and in her heart she knew that none of her shots were going to hit him. Sig jogged up with a wide smile on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I think so," said Lucas. "Good," said Sig. "Now, Lucas, I'm having Lizard scout out the terrain so we can avoid Row 82. I don't want to get too far out of the way, though." "No," said Stephanie through her tablet. "We must go after him." "I appreciate your position, Stephanie," said Sig with a smile, "but we aren't demon worshippers." "But we aren't demon worshippers, and we aren't augments." "I know that," said Stephanie, "but they are." "Stephanie," said Sig. He was cut off by the sound of machine gun fire. "Get down!" shouted Sig as he pushed Lucas and Stephanie behind him, and small puffs of dust flew up around them. "Sig!" shouted Daniel and Kirana at once. Everyone but Lizard had gathered together. Lucas got up and noticed a red mark on Sig's back. He had been shot, and blood was oozing out of the wound. His eyes flashed with anger as he looked up the hill, but then looked to Daniel. "Will he be all right, Doc?" asked Lucas. Daniel pulled out his key and his eyes began to glow. "The bullet did not hit bone, but it did expand inside him," said Daniel with a worried tone. Stephanie's eyes welled up with tears, and guilt swept over her as she thought how her actions had led him to do this thing. "What can I do to help?" she said through her tablet, typing furiously. "How about you don't blindly charge after augments?" shouted Daniel angrily. The tears began to spill out of Stephanie's eyes and rolled down her cheeks. Lucas reached into his pack and pulled out a radio. "Lizard," he barked into the device. "You're actually using the radio as a radio?" asked a calm voice on the other end. "Row 82, said Lucas in a low voice. "Correct," said Row 82 through the radio. "What do you want?" asked Lucas angrily. "I want your divine keys destroyed, and those that have used them punished," replied Row 82. "For what?" asked Lucas. "Blasphemy," replied Row 82. "Only a combination of work and natural ability proved we are worthy to live. Your divine keys do not favor the fit, however, offering power to an elderly man." Daniel whirled around and nearly shouted, but fought the urge and returned to Sig as Row 82's rant continued. "A child?" He was obviously referring to Lucas. Lucas fought the urge to throw the radio against the rocky terrain. "A bunch of flaky women." Kirana's eyes lit up with anger. She pulled up her sniper rifle and searched for a victim, but it appeared their enemies had taken cover behind rocks. "Perhaps the large one would have been fit, had he not been shot. He is obviously no longer fit to survive. If you had any sense, you would kill him." The attention of the group turned to Sig. He coughed briefly as Daniel's eyes ceased glowing. It took a moment for his breath to return to normal, but when it had, he put out his hand asking for the radio. Lucas reluctantly handed it to him. "That's one thing for you to say that I should die," said Sig with a smile. Daniel's efforts had healed him, and there was a look of relief in Stephanie's face. "But if you think any of these women are flaky, you've got another thing coming." "Your divine keys have unnaturally preserved you," said Row 82 angrily. "We have the high ground here, and we will see to it that this blasphemy is corrected. We will—" Sig turned the radio off and handed it to Lucas with a smile. "I think I've heard enough," said Sig. "Let's head for the rocks over there to get better cover." "No," said Lucas with his eyes glowing. "They drove that direction and planted explosives. Let's head the other way." "Fair enough," said Sig as he got to his feet. They moved together over the terrain. When Row 82 realized that they were not listening to his speech, he threw his radio on the ground and shrieked. The horrifying sound echoed through the foothills. "Run," said Lucas. "He knows where we are." The group rushed as small puffs of dust shot up with the firing of machine guns. Suddenly a loud shot rang out. They turned to see Kirana take aim again with her sniper rifle. "Hurry," said Kirana impatiently. She fired again, and the ricochet of her bullet echoed all around them. "Jennifer," said Lucas as he continued running. "Yes?" asked Jennifer. "They have Lizard," said Lucas. "If we don't get him back soon, it may be too late for him." "I won't be late," said Jennifer as she gripped her key and disappeared. Everything slowed down as Jennifer rushed up the hill. At her accelerated speed, the bullets from the machine guns were visible. They were still moving, but she easily dodged them as she scurried up the hill. It was draining for her to do this, but she knew she had to get Lizard back. It was not long before she could see Lizard unconscious in the arms of one of the augments. The augment had mechanical devices embedded in his head, and a machine gun arm pointed down the hill toward her friends. The augments, except for Row 82, were all extremely tall and muscular, and Jennifer guessed they were some kind of super soldiers. She pulled Lizard through the loose grip of the augment and noticed several grenades on the belt of Lizard's captor. When she had pulled Lizard onto her back, she pulled the pin of one of the grenades and began dragging Lizard downhill. "Geez, Lizard, you're too tall to drag properly," said Jennifer as she struggled to keep him moving. After some time, she made it to a large rock and let Lizard slide off her back. She slumped down and her eyes ceased glowing. "Over there," shouted Jonathan. He and Victor rushed toward Jennifer and Lizard. Jennifer smiled as she saw Victor approach, but the exhaustion of carrying Lizard while using her key caused her to slump over unconscious next to Lizard. As Victor and Jonathan reached Jennifer and Lizard, a huge explosion distracted them. The grenade that Jennifer had activated had just blown up. Row 82 shrieked again, partially out of anger and partially to locate everyone. Jonathan and Victor used the confusion to pull Jennifer and Lizard to the gathering place behind a heap of boulders. "What's our next move?" asked Victor. "Jonathan, can you tell me anything about these augments?" asked Lucas. Jonathan put Lizard down and touched his key. After a few moments, with his eyes glowing, he answered. "They just keep saying blasphemy over and over," said Jonathan. "Great," said Kirana with a frown. "Religious augments. That means they are probably depending on their computer systems to make logical, tactical decisions," said Lucas. "If only I were closer to one of them." "Your key is not a tool," said Stephanie through her tablet. "Don't use it like one." Her input surprised Lucas. "What are you saying?" asked Lucas. "I have had," started Stephanie. She looked upward as she thought about what to type. Finally, she continued. "My key gives me visions of the future," said Stephanie. "It is as though it has a will of its own." "The key of origins only seems to tell me about the last locations of one key at a time, though," said Lucas. "Isn't that the same thing?" "No," said Stephanie. "Try not to demand information of your key. Try to let it speak to you." Lucas raised an eyebrow in confusion. He did not understand what Stephanie meant, but he decided it could not hurt him to attempt something different. He touched his key and his eyes began glowing. This time, instead of seeing specific details about the origins of something, he found that the foothills in which he had been crouching moments ago were morphing into a larger tree-covered mountain, and everything around him gained a blue tint. "Very good," said a voice behind him. He whirled around and saw Victor standing there. "Victor?" asked Lucas. "You all seem to be saying that," said Victor. "What?" asked Lucas. "I only appear as Victor," replied Victor. "Then who are you?" asked Lucas. "Is that the question you want answered right now?" asked Victor. "No," said Lucas. "I need to know about the augments that are attacking us." "You have the key of origins," said Victor. "You cannot see things as they are, only as they were." "I know," said Lucas. "I am hoping to find details about how their augmentations were constructed." "Prudent," said Victor, "but that is also the wrong question." "What is the right question?" asked Lucas. "Let me ask if your goals have changed," said Victor. "No, we are still seeking the next key," said Lucas. Suddenly his eyes lit up. He knew the goal of the augments was to destroy them for what they considered blasphemy, and he knew he did not want to attack them while they had the high ground. He could force his opponent to move by fleeing. Row 82 would be compelled to follow, and with Lucas controlling the movements of his enemy, he could get the high ground before attacking. "How has the terrain changed since the keys were lost?" asked Lucas. "That is the right question," said Victor. He vanished out of sight, leaving Lucas alone to examine the mountains in which he found himself. He walked for a short distance and caught sight of a mine entrance. As he touched his key, he could quickly see how the mine connected to a distant set of caves. He focused on the caves and saw the divine key for which he was looking and smiled. Suddenly, another mirrored surface in the same cave system made him stop. He gasped in shock to find a second divine key in the same location. The space key and the perception key had been left in the same cave chamber. Trying to avoid distraction, Lucas focused on the changes that had appeared in the mines and caves to see how best to reach their destination. He watched large sections of the cave crumble, but the mine appeared to remain intact as he watched time fast forward toward the present. The entrance to the mine had eroded away, and there were heaps of rubble over top of where it had been. The erosion slowed as he reached the present. The tall mountains had weathered and the deep valleys had been filled in with sediment, but he had a unique perspective on a rare remnant of the golden age that had survived. The blue tint that had enveloped everything faded away, and Lucas found himself surrounded by his friends. "Did that help, Lucas?" asked Stephanie through her device. "Yes, actually," said Lucas with a smile. "Our goal hasn't changed. We still need to get to the keys. We don't need to fight them when they have the high ground. Let them pursue us." "They've got a truck, Lucas," said Victor with a frown. "It seems like they could pursue us and flank us pretty easily." "They're also very large and strong," added Kirana. "I don't think the terrain will slow them as much as it will slow us." "Unless the terrain is inside a mine," said Lucas with a smile. "Brilliant," said Sig with a smile. Lucas rushed toward a heap of rubble on the side of the hill. "Cover me," he shouted as the sound of gunfire echoed from higher up. Sig pulled out his pistol and began firing and laughing. Stephanie decided it would be a good time to practice with her pistol and pulled it out. Jonathan stood next to her and showed her how to hold it. She smiled as he pulled her hands into a supportive position. He showed her how to stand. She raised her weapon, pointed toward the sound of enemy fire, and squeezed the trigger. The kick was substantial, but she kept her balance. She smiled and fired a few more rounds. Suddenly she was distracted by a huge explosion near where Lucas had gone. "Come on!" shouted Lucas as he motioned to the others. Sig pulled Lizard onto his back. Victor carried Jennifer as they rushed toward the newly opened cave. It was not long before they had crawled into the mouth of the mine. The air inside was surprisingly fresh, in spite of how well the entrance had been covered. Lucas knew that the erosion outside had allowed both water and air to slowly seep in throughout the mine, but that the sturdy frames every 10 yards kept the tunnel intact. The element that was not present was light. Lucas opened his pack and distributed the small flashlights he had brought. "We still have to be careful," said Lucas. "This route is more direct and should shave a day off of our trip, but we don't want to run out of batteries in here. Stephanie, that means you should probably limit using your tablet. We can't just charge it in here." Stephanie nodded. Lucas strapped one of his grenades to the ceiling and strung wire around several rocks around the opening, and then tied the end to the ring on the grenade pin. "That's not going to buy us a lot of time," said Lucas as he directed everyone into the mine, "but we can set up more elaborate traps later. Let's just get a head start while he thinks we're preparing to attack him." The group had walked into the mine for about 5 minutes when Row 82 shrieked again. He listened carefully and then realized that his enemies were not surrounding the hilltop as he had predicted. He shrieked again and listened. "Where are they?" said one of the augments impatiently. "Shut up, Charon 17, barked Row 82. He shrieked again and listened more carefully. "They're running," said Row 82 with a frown. "They can't run far," said Charon 17. "You have a truck." "They are inside a mine. The truck won't fit," said Row 82. He smiled widely. "It's a good thing they don't know about your augmentations." Charon 17 laughed as his eyes began to shine red. "It's true," said Charon 17. "Darkness is precisely where we are most fit." Row 82 looked at the augments around him. They made their way to the mine entrance. "Hang on," said Charon 17 as he pointed to the grenade on the ceiling. He cut the wire attached to the pin and pocketed the grenade. "That may come in handy." Row 82 was visibly angry. "They will pay for their blasphemy," said Row 82. Several of the augments grunted their support as Row 82 continued. "They will pay for what they did to your brother, Charon 19. They will not survive the night." The augment's heightened senses revealed that Row 82 truly believed what he was saying. They smiled as they rushed into the mine to hunt the Divine Key bearers. The group did not dare to stop and sleep in their exhaustion. They knew that if they were to stop and the augments did not, they would be overtaken. They had traveled for nearly 18 hours. Though they had managed their flashlights and water well, they were anxious to reach the end of the tunnel. There was not much space in the mine, and since Lizard had regained consciousness, he was frustrated with the height of the mine. Sig was also weary of slouching. Jonathan and Victor were just short enough that they were okay until they got to one of the beams. Each of them had hit their heads several times. Lucas and the women were short enough that the height was no trouble for them. It was one of the first times that Lucas had been happy about his height. He had not focused too much on his stature, however, as he was primarily concerned with why they had not heard any explosions from the traps he had set. The tripwires were well disguised, and even with light the shadows should have concealed them. He had hoped to have an advantage in the mines, but guessed that their augmentations were probably contributing to the lack of traps set off. The sound of Row 82's shriek was closer than the last time he had heard it. Lucas had decided that he would need to set the trap himself. He had strapped a grenade to the ceiling similar to his last attempts, only instead of attaching wire as a tripwire, he had simply carefully unwound the spool as he walked, ensuring that it was just a little slack. He had also instructed the others to go ahead. Notwithstanding Daniel's protest that Lucas was not valuing his life, and that he had a bigger purpose than being blown to bits, he had won the argument. The sound of Row 82's shriek echoed through the hall. Lucas smiled and yanked hard on the spool as he began sprinting toward his friends. The sound of the explosion cut Row 82's shriek short. Dust poured toward them and clouded their vision. "Lucas!" shouted Daniel. "I'm okay, Doc," shouted Lucas. "That was way too close," said Daniel as the dust settled. "Well, let's move then," said Lucas as he hurried past Daniel. The sound of rubble stirring behind them told them that they had not bought a lot of time. Sig smiled and threw another grenade behind them, then urged everyone forward. It exploded, and the sound of another shriek echoed through the mine. "We're close now," said Lucas. Jennifer decided to speed things up. She gripped her key and her eyes began to glow. Even though she knew that creating a time bubble around her friends to help them go quicker would be exhausting, she did it anyway. She thought that the faster they got there, the sooner they could rest, and she had gone too long without rest. "Jennifer," scolded Daniel, "you should not exhaust yourself." "I'm already exhausted," said Jennifer, "but I don't want to arrive too late." Victor smiled as they rushed through the mine. After only a few minutes, they came to a large opening. Jennifer's eyes ceased glowing, and she slumped to the ground. She was barely aware of Victor catching her so that her head did not hit the rocky cave floor. They took a moment to survey the cavern in which they stood. There were stalagmites and stalactites everywhere, and running water had carved and built various platforms of rock. It was larger than any building they had seen. Looking carefully at the ground, they noticed small piles of rust scattered everywhere. "We need to get the keys," said Lucas as he walked ahead. Lucas knew exactly where they had been left. His ability to see the past would have undoubtedly helped them retrieve the 2 keys in the cavern quickly, but his lack of ability to see the present prevented him from recognizing the enemy in the darkness. There was a thud, and Lucas fell unconscious to the floor. "Lucas!" shouted Sig. Sig shined his flashlight in Lucas's direction to see a tall man in a large dark cloak. He pulled the hood back to reveal a familiar tattooed face and a menacing smile. Lizard clenched his fists in anger. "Felix Light," said Lizard.